welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Matt Bruckner, an associate professor of law at Howard University School of Law. My guest tonight is C.J. Ryan, associate professor at Roger Williams University School of Law, and we'll be talking about his new article, Paying for Law School, Law Student Loan Indebtedness and Career Choices. C.J., welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
So I'd love to just have you give us maybe the article's sort of elevator pitch. What's your thesis? What are your main arguments? What's novel here?
So I became interested in this question in doing my doctoral dissertation research on the economics of legal education, and seeing that the cost of legal education has really tripled or even quadrupled over the last 20 or so years gave me pause. And as a relatively recent graduate of law school, it was something that I thought needed greater sort of analysis. And one of the things that I wanted to look at specifically was student borrowing patterns over this time. And so in doing my dissertation research, I collected data from four national law schools. I'm not at liberty to say which law schools, but they sort of adhere to a typology that I can describe as: one was a private elite law school, another a public flagship law school, and another a public regional law school, and finally a private newer law school, non-elite. And I think they represent a fairly nice cross-section of the various types of law schools that exist in the country, that are accredited by the American Bar Association, and that adhere more or less to tiers of reputational quality. And so in collecting data from these law schools, I was trying to answer a few questions, including questions about why the students chose that law school. But I sort of baked into my survey questions about students' levels of indebtedness, the cost of legal education that they were bearing individually, and how they were paying for law school, and as well as a series of questions about their sort of attitudes toward financial risk. And I think I got some really good data, enough to answer, at least from a perspective that was satisfactory to me, about how they felt about their options to repay their debts that they were incurring to study law and get a JD. And so this paper really deals with the role of law student loan indebtedness on their career choices, the types of law that they want to practice and the types of jobs that they want to pursue. And that was the seed that sort of germinated throughout the last couple years, and I've been able to sort of, I think, link a lot of the existing literature on the role of debt and its effect on career choices with my own findings, and that's what I present in the paper.
That's great. So, student indebtedness is obviously a big issue. I saw just today a headline that indebtedness now tops $1.7 trillion, and law students are a particular concern. They borrow, more than certainly the average undergraduate student. What are your main findings in the paper?
Well, descriptively, I find that the types of students that are incurring the greatest amounts of debt, pretty unsurprisingly, are students that come from lower SES backgrounds as proxied by parental education and parental earnings, but also students that come from underrepresented minority backgrounds, and to a large degree, women. And this sort of confirms the descriptive trends that other scholars in the area have noted about levels of indebtedness for law students. So I think that's at least a useful descriptive finding, but the empirical findings are, to my mind, a little more challenging about what it is that we should do within the legal academy about how to address student loan indebtedness. And ultimately, the factors I think that are interesting to me in terms of this relationship, this causal relationship between debt and career choice, I find that overwhelmingly students from underrepresented minority backgrounds, lower SES backgrounds, and women are sort of relying on the PSLF program as a means for paying back their substantial law school debt. And I think it really makes a strong argument for keeping the PSLF around. These are students who desire to work in the public sector and see the PSLF program as really their only means of escaping their seemingly insurmountable debt, and serving in careers that have substantially less financial remuneration options for them.
Yeah, so the public service loan forgiveness program, you say, is a way that some of these students feel like they can repay their debt, and so certainly, later in the paper, I feel like you talk about how the program could counter what you'd refer to as a sort of public service drift and to the access to justice gap. But at times, earlier in the paper, you talk about just the enormous costs of the program and its sort of difficulty of maybe being financially sustainable, which seems like a real tension. And so, do you feel like you are so? What are your views about the public service loan forgiveness program and its importance to law students, to law schools going forward?
So I think first and foremost, the cost of legal education is something that has to be addressed, and there's no silver bullet to do that. I think the public service loan forgiveness program isn't narrowly tailored to address the rising cost of higher education more generally, and specifically the rising cost of legal education. But we know that there is a substantial access to justice gap, which I sort of operationalize as the unmet legal need in this country, and the public service loan forgiveness program is working. I think it is incentivizing graduates to take on public sector jobs, public facing jobs where they're serving critical public need. So I think the PSLF program helps in many ways to solve that access to justice gap. I also think it helps to maybe reduce the public interest drift. That is, if students see that their cost of legal education to them is something that can be mitigated by loan forgiveness, then they're more apt to take on those types of jobs that they maybe came to law school to do in the first place. Mm-hmm. And so I think the PSLF program, while not a silver bullet, is particularly apt at addressing the public interest drift and the access to justice gap. With respect to the question about the cost of the public service loan forgiveness program, it's very costly. I think there's no question about that, and the funding that the Department of Education has received to fulfill its obligation to forgive these loans is not really something that is sustainable at current levels of appropriation for the program, especially given that there's expected to be a new wave of borrowers who are going to become eligible for forgiveness. And so as a result, I think Congress and the presidential administration sort of need to fund the PSLF program at the right level to make that promise a reality.
Okay, so your concern is mostly just that funding levels are insufficient, but are endorse the program as one that is a valuable expenditure of taxpayer dollars. We're sort of doing right by students in the country by forgiving their law school debt. Even though you do at one point, I think, suggests that the program may even be increasing rather than helping to control costs in law schools, because students may feel freer to borrow more money since they expect someone else will repay it.
I think that's the biggest, at least stated con of the program, or I should say, those who are critical of the PSLF program note that there is a sort of problem with over borrowing, or at least that students aren't as that the debt loads that they incur aren't terribly salient to them with the promise of possible forgiveness, right? And so I think that is a real structural issue with the PSLF program, but it's not one, I think, that on the margins is going to motivate a student whether or not to participate in the program. I really think truly those students who are taking advantage of the program's forgiveness element have given up a lot of opportunity costs, right? They've stayed in a public service role for over 10 years when they could have been in private practice or some other field. And so I'm not as concerned, I think, about that as many of the critics are, but I reference that criticism because I think it is a valid one.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure the approval rates have been, I don't know whether, really abysmal. I mean, terribly, terribly low. And so, curious how much, students would be willing to, borrow maximum amount possible on the hope of getting forgiveness. Since, I mean, what was the approval rate this last year? Did it hit 1%?
It was about 1%, which you're right, is abysmally low. And I expect, and other forecasters have expected that rate to go up substantially. A big reason was just this past week, the Department of Education announced that they're merging both the PSLF and the temporary expansion of the PSLF program applications. That there were technically two separate applications, and so many temporary expansion PSLF applicants were denied because they hadn't applied for PSLF forgiveness. They were two separate sort of forms that one had to fill out, and so there was also a tremendous amount of sort of clerical errors that students encountered in trying to file their applications, and learned that they were denied because the clerical errors had foreclosed them from being forgiven on their first application. So many folks expect that this number of the approval rate will increase in the very near term, and so I think that the 1% approval rate was really just kind of an issue of the system sort of working out the kinks, as it were.
Yeah, my understanding is that the program has just been really administratively complex for borrowers to comply with. So you talk in the paper about the benefits of PSLF and about this access to justice gap and public interest drift. Can you talk a little bit more about those? What are they, and how does PSLF remedy those problems?
So I'll first address the access to justice gap. I think the Legal Services Corporation and other organizations have studied and identified this access to justice gap as the amount of unmet legal need that's met in this country, and it's substantial. I think the Legal Services Corporation estimates that about 70% of folks who encounter severe civil legal problems in this country are either unable to or unsuccessful at securing legal representation in those matters. And so I think the PSLF, by incentivizing law students to pursue careers in the public sector, is one mechanism, right? One, hopefully, of many more that need to be aimed at targeting the access to justice gap, but is one mechanism that can help to reduce that dramatically large number of folks who need and want representation. With respect to the public interest drift, it's not a term that I coined by any means. It's something that's been identified by folks who sort of study legal education from perhaps a sociological perspective, and thinking about the way that law school might orient students to more private sector careers, right? And the types of courses that they take that are prescribed in the 1L curriculum and otherwise, that there is a inherently sort of private orientation toward the law school, toward legal education, and I think that it's sort of no secret that many law students are choosing to go to law school, particularly with recent increases in law school enrollment. noted as the Trump bump, that students are really seeking to be forces of social change. And so to the extent that legal education removes that orientation from them or orients them in a different way, that's what the public interest drift, I think, is trying to capture this the way in which students might come to law school for a public interest reason and ultimately end up taking jobs in the private sector, either because they're much more lucrative or because they feel that their training has sort of led them toward that path. And so I think that the public service loan forgiveness program is one mechanism to reduce that drift. It basically says, if you want to pursue this career, right, it's not foreclosed to you, even if you're taking out substantial loans to attend law school, that you can still go that route. You can still help the people in your community and more broadly in society, if that's something you choose to spend 10 years of your early practice doing. And so I really feel that the PSLF program is sort of maybe undersold in that regard, that it has has real and impactful ways of ensuring that students who are so oriented are able to stay on a public sector leaning track.
I can see how it certainly makes that financially affordable with the rising cost of law school to make it possible to take a job like that. I mean, I remember when I started in law school, I was talking with the career services director about a job that he was offered that he felt that he just couldn't afford to take. And so, the idea that, having loan forgiveness that would make that job possible to take, I think is very appealing, but it certainly doesn't affect the sort of, the socialization aspects you're talking about, or, the early hiring done by large law firms, right? It's, appealing, I think, to lots of students to have a job in hand early. And you're right? Law schools sort of uh, push their students to take these jobs as well. And public service loan forgiveness is not going to help with those problems, right?
Yeah, I think it helps to level the playing field somewhat, and that's the real issue here, is that it's I think it's hard to turn the wheel of the law school socialization sort of evenly as between private and public sector jobs, and certainly it's hard for public sector employers to compete with the types of salaries that entry level law graduates are able to earn in private sector jobs. But for students who are maybe interested, at least in the public sector, it, as I say, levels the playing field. It allows them to see that they're not going to be destitute if they plan to go that route, because PSLF is based on an income driven repayment plan. So their initial loan repayments are not going to be outrageous, and should they choose to stay in the public sector role for 10 years, their loans will be forgiven. So what remains of it anyway after paying into the program for 10 years. So I think it's an uphill battle that public sector employers are having to fight. And I know that public sector employers are very fond of giving as much information to potential hires about this program as a means for being competitive with private sector employers. And so to remove the program, I think, removes any real footing that public sector employers have for recruiting entry level students who acquire significant debt to attend law school.
It's still also a long time, right? I mean, a lot of my students are relatively recent college grads, 23, 24, and the idea of spending, 10 years in a role that they may have um, little exposure with, that's also just a substantial period of their career. Do you have any thoughts about the mechanism by which the program operates? And is the 10-year period of time a sort of a sensible benchmark for forgiveness?
So, I've actually been thinking about this in the context of the Democratic candidate debates and various sort of reforms that have been proposed to the program. You know, I actually was talking with my students today about the statute of limitations in adverse possession actions and comparing, for instance, a state like Arkansas, which has a 7-year statute of limitations um, for adverse possession to accrue, but Pennsylvania has like a 21-year statute of limitation or something like that. And there are different approaches that could be used here. The advantage of having I think a lower statute of limitation for adverse possession claims is that it gets the property in the hands of the highest and best users sooner, and the disadvantage of having a short window like that is that it lets the true landowner, it increases their monitoring costs, right, for adverse possessors. Similarly, I think the PSLF program window is sort of arbitrarily set at 10 years. I mean, I'm not sure that a decade in public sector service is necessarily the best approach, right? I think something shorter might be more ideal, might be more optimal. Um, perhaps 7 years is uh, a better benchmark for determining that the student has, really committed to this type of work and has made an impactful, um, career decision where they're serving their community for a substantial period of time. And you mentioned that many of your students are 23, 24 coming out. Those students, it sounds to me, would be those just out of undergraduate when they're starting law school, and by the time they're 30, to be basically um, out from under their debt obligations would be sensible.
Yeah, I guess I was also thinking maybe that instead of a 10-year period of time or a 7-year period of time, that there could be sort of 10% of your loans forgiven every year or something along those lines, so that you weren't sort of held to sort of working in this job for 10 years, because it sounds like there's a lot of you talk about the access to justice gap, a lot of unmet legal need, and if folks are willing to move, you talk also particularly about sort of needs in sort of rural areas, people willing to move to um, rural areas and provide legal services for even shorter periods of time. It would seem like that would be um, something worth encouraging.
And to that end, several sort of reform proposals have tried to do just that, or proposed at least some amount of forgiveness after the first 2.5 years, half forgiveness after 5 years, and then sort of incremental amounts after that. That might be a more reasonable approach. I don't know what the right solution is, but I do think that 10 years for any forgiveness is definitely too long. I think to your point, it's possible that sort of an incremental approach might actually be greater at addressing the access to justice gap, and might incentivize far more students to go a public sector route for the initial years of their practicing careers upon graduation, um, and address that need sooner.
Yeah. Um, so I was interested a lot in also in the piece about the access to justice gap, which is not something in terms of the provision of legal services that I think about sort of holistically. I'm involved with legal service organizations here in DC, an organization called ZDEC. That provides legal services to low-income DC residents, particularly on sort of consumer financial issues. It seemed like some of the focus you had was about, again, sort of rural areas, and you're saying that lots of people who with legal problems don't seek legal help. And I guess my first thought was that I said this previously to you that I if I'm not feeling well, I don't go to the doctor right away. I go to the doctor if I've got some sort of really acute pain, or something's really pushing me to go. And so I was curious about this this access to justice gap, and you having read the literature a lot more, what do you think about the claims that there is this huge unmet legal need, and will public service loan forgiveness encourage people to meet that need, in particularly for people who live in rural areas?
So, my answer to your question is sort of twofold. With respect to the first part, I think that the access to justice gap that the Legal Services Corporation defines in its studies is thinking about acute problems, right? Those more severe problems that essentially require representation and really disadvantage folks who would represent themselves pro se or just sort of let the process play out without counsel. Um, and as such, I think that the public service loan forgiveness program presents a really useful mechanism for addressing that need, regardless of where the client would be located. But I don't know if you saw in the American Bar Association Journal this past month, or this current month rather, the cover story was a story titled "No Country for Rural Lawyers." There's a major problem in this country um, of attorneys being located in rural areas. There just aren't enough of them. And many lawyers that do represent clients in rural areas, particularly in the middle of the country, have to drive tens, if not 100 miles to meet with their clients, because there are no more lawyers in these small communities than once had them. And so I think, combined with the fact that there is a sort of recent phenomenon in which particularly millennials are locating themselves in less urban areas to have lower costs of living. I think the PSLF program actually could sort of ride that descriptive population outmigration wave and help to address the really dire need for lawyers in rural areas, and incentivize students to pursue that path.
That's interesting. My sort of sense was that millennials all wanted to live in sort of urban cores. But I guess you're saying that folks are getting priced out and are moving out. This has also been an issue for doctors too for a long time. My understanding is that there's been a sort of a shortage of so maybe it's just a shortage of sort of professionals, or medical legal professionals living in sort of more rural areas. Um, hmm. All right. Well, this is a little bit less my area of expertise, but I was hoping you would tell the audience a little bit more about your empirical analysis, a little bit more about the findings you had from your surveys of these students of these 4 different law schools.
Sure. So the initial tables that I present in the fourth part of the article are descriptive in nature. They essentially say, patterns of students in terms of their intentions to enroll in the public service loan forgiveness program by, for instance, race or the debt that they have or expect to have upon graduation. And those are fairly, I think, easy to interpret. I tried to put them in terms of percentages of students in each category by the school that they're attending. In the results section of that same part, I use a model called a logistic regression model, and this is different from an ordinary least squares regression model, which is sort of the standard approach to regression, in that it bounds a dichotomous dependent variable, which means that the student's intention to enroll in PSLF or to choose a public sector program, I coded as basically 0 or 1, right? And so if you have a dichotomous variable like that, or a binary dependent variable like that, the problem with using an ordinary least squares approach is that the probabilities that the student will choose that as expressed in the coefficients of the independent variables will not be bounded by 0 and 1 in an OLS approach. But a logistic regression does bound the dependent variable between 0 and 1. So all the tables that I present in my regression results um, are looking at the likelihood that a student has a public service career intention or it plans to participate in the PSLF program in terms of odds ratios. And odds ratios are they're tricky. Um, they're tricky for one reason to interpret, but I think I've done a decent job in terms of interpreting them for the reader. Basically, the number one um, represents that net of all other sort of controls, that a student is about the same on average as their counterpart or the counterfactual um, to choose to, for instance, participate in PSLF or to have an intention to pursue a public service career. So any number over one represents a percentage increase in their odds of choosing that career path or the participation in PSLF. Any number below one represents a decreased odds for that group of choosing that career path or PSLF participation. And so just kind of serially going through the findings here, I find that, with respect to a student's intention to pursue a public service interest career, students who come from homes where their parents earned incrementally $50,000 more, that represents about a 21 percentage odd decrease or likelihood that they would choose to elect for a public service career upon graduating. Students who do better in law school by 1/10 of a GPA point, so a 3.1 versus a 3.0 or a 3.6 versus a 3.5, that 1/10 of a GPA point represents about a 12% reduction in the odds that they would, for instance, choose a public service career. And then as cost of attendance rises by $10,000, for every $10,000, it represents about roughly a 5% decrease in likelihood the student would elect for a public service career upon graduating.
So just to be clear, what you're saying is that students from wealthier families who have a higher law school GPA are substantially less likely to engage to have public service careers. Yeah,
That's right. That's right. And so I think this speaks to sort of the um, Bourdieusian model of social reproduction. The Pierre Bourdieu idea is that parents sort of inculcate in their children these ideals of what a career and what education should be, and so it's very likely that students who come from wealthier homes are going to be more attracted to private sector careers than public service careers, at least in terms of this analytic sample that I have. That's the finding, right? And so um, this also speaks, I think, somewhat to the point that you were making earlier about the public interest drift and the fact that private sector employees rather, are very good at recruiting early. And I find that students with better GPAs are about 12% less likely. For every 1/10 of a GPA point, they're less likely to want to pursue a public service interest career. And
and
then also,
and does that have
go
any sort
ahead.
of does that have any sort of cutoff? Right? Is there some is that because students, with a whatever a 3.5 and above are more likely to be recruited into sort of large law firms, and so they're attracted by the uh, early sort of hiring patterns of large law firms? And does that sort of hold all the way down the GPA spectrum, or is there some sort of level at which these students are unlikely to be recruited into whatever Am Law 100 firms, and so therefore there's sort of a little bit this sort of um, early hiring patterns or sort of the larger salaries are sort of just less available to them.
So in this particular model, when I'm looking at just public service career intentions, I had all four law schools in there, which included the private elite law school. In the second one, the PSLF intention, I had three, and not the private elite, but the other three law schools. So to answer your question, there is there are observations that I have in the sort of the full analytic sample with all four law schools. There are observations that I see with students above, for instance, a 3.7 GPA that are interested in public service careers, but they are the exception rather than the rule. And so this isn't all the way down the GPA spectrum, but I think it's definitely looking at students sort of around that sort of maybe 3.3 to 3.6 range, because that was the mode kind of area for GPAs in my analytic sample.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I found this section of the paper sort of, I'm not an empiricist and sort of deciding whether sort of using, ordinary least squared analysis or regressions is the is an appropriate or inappropriate choice. Is not, I'm some sense of what you're saying with it, but I found this section really very readable, and sort of the conclusions you draw from it, interesting and engaging, and hopefully. We'll sort of be able to draw some additional conclusions from it. Is there more about this section? You think are there other interesting conclusions that you took away from this analysis?
Yeah, so I haven't really spoken much about Table 4 just yet, and so what I find in Table 4, which is the public service program participation intentions, is that by and large, the students who are most likely to want to participate in this program, the largest effects I see are based on gender and race, and women in my analytic sample were about 3 times as likely as their male counterparts at a statistically significant level to have an intention to participate in this program. And likewise, for race, almost 2 times as likely for an underrepresented racial minority to want to participate in this program than their white counterparts. And so what that tells me is that, we know descriptively that women and underrepresented minorities tend to carry greater debt loads and also tend to be sort of more represented in public sector careers than their white and male counterparts on the whole. And so the idea that they would also be saddled with this debt and entering sort of lower pay positions and not have the PSLF program to sort of help them get out of that debt after serving in the career for 10 years is really alarming to me because of the recent sort of calls for the elimination of the program. And so I wanted to sort of highlight that descriptive fact that is revealed in my empirical findings.
Thanks. Yeah, and I know that you drew on some of the, I always forget what an acronym stands, the LSSE Law School Survey of Student Engagement data. And they talked about this issue you're discussing, but also, the larger issue I think that Aaron Taylor described is the reverse Robin Hood effect of the students who, based on their incoming credentials, are sort of least likely to be successful in law school and have high-paying jobs, able to service all of their debt, are also most likely to incur the most debt for law school and subsidize their, classmates with higher incoming credentials, who are, I think, statistically more likely to have the higher paying jobs post graduation. And so this is a real issue, and I appreciate you highlighting this.
Oh, it was my pleasure, and Aaron Taylor and his work is so important, and I have to give a shout out to Access Lex Institute, which he is a senior director there, and they actually helped to fund this project, at least the survey collection in its early stages. So I'm very grateful for his work and for his funding.
All right. Well, I want to wrap up sooner rather than later, but I want to give you the chance. Are there any things about the paper that I didn't ask? Any sort of last thoughts you'd like to share about this project, or how it relates to other things you're working on?
So, the broad sort of area of legal education is something of interest to me and is sort of informing, um, I should say, been forming a nice sort of stick in the bundle of sticks that is my research agenda. And I've really, uh, you know, enjoyed, I guess, the positive sort of feedback that I've gotten on this article from folks like you and Cassie Christopher at Texas Tech and Jerry Organ at St. Thomas and others. This is the issue of student loan indebtedness is a real concern, I think, that needs to be addressed. And there, as I said earlier, there's no sort of silver bullet, as it were, to address that issue. But I think that the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program is one that definitely has benefits that outweigh its costs and deserves our consideration going forward.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining us and for talking about the paper. I look forward to seeing where you place this new article, which is available on SSRN. We'll post a link and some data in the show notes. So thanks a lot for joining.
Thank you, Matt.
All right, have a great night.
You too.
This is a song to celebrate banks, because they're full of money and you go into them and all you hear is clinks and clanks. Or maybe a sound like the wind in the trees on the hills, which is the rustling of the $1,000 bills. Most bankers dwell in marble halls, which they get to dwell in because they encourage deposits and discourage withdrawals. And particularly because they all observe one rule, which woe betides the banker who fails to heed it, which is you must never lend any money to anybody unless they don't need it. Oh, you cautious conservative banks, what I know about you. If people are worried about their rent, it is your duty to deny them the loan of 1 Confederate sou. But suppose people come in and they have $1 million and they want another $1 million to pile on top of it. Why, you brim with the milk of human kindness and you urge them to accept every drop of it. And you lend them the $1 million, so then they have $2 million, and this gives them the idea that they would be better off with 4. So they already have $2 million as security, so you have no hesitation in lending them 2 more. And all the vice presidents nod their heads in rhythm. And the only question asked is, do the borrowers want the money sent, or do they want to take it with them? But please do not think that I'm not fond of banks, because I think they deserve our appreciation and thanks. Because they perform a valuable public service in eliminating the jackasses who go around saying that health and happiness are everything and money isn't essential. Because as soon as they have to borrow some unimportant money to maintain their health and happiness, they starve to death so they can't go around anymore sneering at good old money, which is nothing short of providential.